Somber, archival WW2 realism, calm, serious, and historically grounded. The carrier breathed like a living thing in the cold. A steady rumble felt through every boot sole. Under blackout hoods, the deck lamps made small sepia pools, and men moved through them with the careful rhythm of midnight workers. On the island bridge, Admiral Percival Arden studied a hand-inked plan of Taranto, corners curled from salt and fingers. He pressed his palm flat on the parchment, as if steadying the sea itself. "We strike in harbor," he said to no one and everyone, "low, slow, and certain." Wind worried the silent flags. Forward, maintenance teams finished their rituals. A wrench pocketed, doped fabric tapped with a fingernail, a propeller wiped with a rag that would never be clean again. The ferry Swordfish waited with wings like chapel rafters, antique, holy, stubbornly alive. Lieutenant Jonah Kest walked the length of his machine, feeling each strut with his palm. Touch, trust, repeat. He named the fear and found it was simply attention sharpened to a blade. Commander E. LeVar stepped to the chalked flight line with a folder and a face that would not tremble. "Listen close," she told the crews. "Your torpedoes have wooden fins. They will run shallow if you do your part. Fly lower than pride and slower than fear. Run in height 60 to 70 feet. Release just above 90 knots. Keep beneath their predictive sights. If you climb, you die." A ripple of laughter, agreement more than mirth, moved across the line. Pencils scratched corrections on knee maps. No one wanted to say aloud that this plan bordered on madness. Admiral Arden joined her and made the circle smaller. "Admiral Fleet has counted your odds," he said. "I have counted your names. If this fails, it will fail loudly. If it succeeds, the world will sound different tomorrow." No cheers followed. Gloves tightened. Somewhere below, a bosun's pipe trilled. Small, bird-like, perfectly ordinary. Routine wrapped itself around fear like canvas around a spar. Engines coughed awake one by one. Smoke lay flat across the black water. The first prop wash ruffled sleeves as men braced the wings. Kest climbed into his cockpit and strapped down the talismans of habit: lap belt, shoulder harness, pencil above the map board, and the folded letter he would not read. His wireless operator, able seaman Davy Rook, bumped knuckles against the frame and made a private promise to the night. Fuel taps, open. Magnetos, both. Throttle, set. The Bristol engine answered with a steady growl.
From the island came a single lamp blink. "Proceed." Var raised her arm and chopped it down. "Chocks out." The deck narrowed into a road to either glory or water. The carrier turned slightly into wind as though offering breath to each departing crew. Kest pushed the throttle. The tail lifted. The wheels skittered, and the prow of the ship slid backward along his peripheral vision. At the ramp's edge, the night opened like a trap, and beyond it, an invisible hand lifted the biplane clean. The sea fell away. Only wind, engine, and the thin, stubborn line of a mission remained. Behind, the carrier shrank to a dim rectangle of geometry and ordered courage. Ahead, past a horizon without features, lay a quiet harbor that believed itself invulnerable. Kest trimmed a notch and felt the machine settle into that warrior's hush that comes before the first arrow flies. "Taranto," he whispered into his mask, shaping the word as if it could bend fate. "We are coming low." The formation gathered across the dark like ink stitching itself into a single thread. One by one, the Swordfish slid into position until the carrier was only a memory behind them, and the Mediterranean below looked like polished obsidian. Lieutenant Jonah Kest eased his throttle and held the glide, letting the wings carry more than the engine. The night rewarded slowness. Speed belonged to men who feared being seen. Tonight, invisibility lived in gentleness. To his left, Flight Leader Rowan Hale rocked his wings once, a silent signal. formation steady. Ahead, the lead element dipped slightly, guiding them toward the long black coastline where Italy slept behind its shield of harbor guns. In the rear seat, Davy Rook leaned into his intercom mic. Radio tight, only brakes for bearings. His voice was thin over the wind but steady. The crews all knew the rule. Chatter kills flights, faster than flak. This kind of flying asked for humility, not heroics. The Swordfish didn't cut through the air. They rested on it, like gulls that had chosen discipline over grace. And yet, there was a strange peace here. The sea was a velvet road. The sky a lid lowered gently over everything breakable. Far off, lightning winked along the horizon like distant artillery rehearsing for a war not yet awake. Rowan Hale's navigation lights flickered twice, the reminder they were nearly at the silent gate, the invisible border beyond which no lights, no mistakes, and no mercy would apply. Kest adjusted trim again. The airframe creaked like an old cathedral beam but held. These biplanes were not pretty accidents from an earlier age. They were patient weapons built for punishment and forgiveness. A modern monoplane lived or died by momentum. A Swordfish lived by stubbornness. Rook tapped Kest's shoulder once. Fuel check. Kest answered with a thumbs up without taking his eyes from the horizon. Every man aboard these craft had already accepted the truth no one dared speak in a ready room. If one plane took a hit too low or too early, ditching meant hypothermia before pickup. Tonight's courage was not loud or cinematic. It was quiet, mathematical, worn into bone.
Somber archive of World War II realism, calm, serious, and historically grounded. The coastline began to show itself not as a shape, but as a darker absence of sea. Italy rose like a sleeping stone beast. Beyond that lay Taranto, moored giants, magazine holds full of proud steel, and doctrine that believed shallow water was a sanctuary. The very thing that gave the Italian fleet confidence was the blind corner the British were about to turn into a blade. Rowan signaled turn in. The formation split. 2 attack waves, threading toward the harbor from different angles. Kest's cockpit dipped lower still until he could smell the sea, feel its weight through the prop wash. Rook switched off the downward lamp. All light now was forbidden. Their world narrowed to wind pressure, map memory, and faith in the mathematics of shallow torpedoes. Somewhere ahead, the first Italian picket light swept the sky. Hale didn't break formation. He trusted slowness like a shield. The Swordfish weren't outrunning danger. They were refusing to present the shape danger was trained to hit. In Kest's cockpit, time thinned. The mission stopped feeling like a plan and became a held breath stretching across miles. Low and slow, he repeated in silence, not as orders now, but as a vow. The biplanes pressed forward, wings ancient, purpose new, sinking into the mouth of history with all the speed of a prayer whispered deliberately. The coastline unfurled beneath them like a shadow turning into architecture. Far ahead, the first probing beam of a searchlight raked the sky, nervous and unfocused, hunting ghosts long before it found men. Jonah Kest brought his Swordfish a hair lower until spray mist kissed the undercarriage each time the wind sagged. The harbor lay beyond a thin spit of land and breakwater, an arm of stone thrown around giants sleeping at anchor. He could feel the size of them before he saw them. The searchlight stiffened, their lazy sweep sharpening into deliberate combing lines across the night. Italian gunners were waking, a harbor's heartbeat turning restless. In the rear seat, Davy Rook made a tiny notion, 2 fingers against Kest's shoulder. Light discipline perfect, but enemy alert phase rising. Kest didn't answer. He couldn't risk a glance back. He let his eyes live only in the corridor of space ahead, every nerve stretching outward like antenna. Then came the first pass of brilliance. A search beam slashed wide and brilliant across the water, turning spray into silver smoke. The Swordfish froze into stillness, not physically, but in the bone-deep silence that lives inside a man when discovery hangs inches away. The beam drifted, caught the corner of another wave, then swept on. Their speed, ridiculously slow for an attack craft, saved them because predictive flat crews expected a climb, not a creeping crawl. Tonight, flying like prey was a weapon. Further inland, Italian crews tumbled from ready rooms and barracks, dragging belts of ammunition, shouting half-dressed orders. Some still believed they were chasing reconnaissance ghosts. No one expected torpedo bombers this deep, this calm, this quiet. The Mediterranean itself seemed to be sheltering them, working as co-conspirator. Kest tightened his grip. Light touch, no sudden correction. He could feel Hale's lead craft just off his port side like a steady pulse.
Somber archival World War II realism, calm, serious, and historically grounded. The Swordfish now threaded the narrow throat into Taranto's inner basin. Here the water was glassy and shallow enough to tempt arrogance. Italy trusted physics more than imagination. They believed no torpedo could run shallow without diving itself into uselessness. They believed wrong, and every British pilot crossing that threshold knew he was now riding not a machine, but a theory wrapped in canvas and prayer. Another beam tore down from a tower, this time closer, stuttering across wake churn. The roar of a distant AA gun snapped the night into war, one test shot, then another. Rook braced for tracers that might follow, but the first bursts went high, overcompensating for altitude that did not exist. The Swordfish were below expectation in every sense, beneath doctrine, beneath training, beneath aim. Kest exhaled slowly through his mask. The harbor silhouette finally broke into detail. Rows of dark hulls, battleship shoulders looming like headlands. They were lined up in pride and logic, perfect targets, unaware of the new geometry that now threatened them. No one aboard those giants had yet understood they were inside a coffin made of assumptions. On the far flank of the formation, Hale dipped his wings once more, run-in bearing confirmed. This was the moment where flight became ritual. No pilot spoke, no radio crackled. Every man entered that solitary chamber inside his chest where war becomes both smallest and largest. The Swordfish crept through the defenses, not evading them by skill, but by contradiction. The harbor thought it was awake, it was only blinking. And the raiders, slow as breath, were already inside its ribs. The moment of release was no longer a plan, it was a promise pressed into time. The Swordfish began to fan into their strike lanes, angling toward the anchored giants whose hulls glowed faintly in spill light from the dockyards. Lieutenant Jonah Kest could feel his heartbeat sinking with the engine rhythm, steady, deliberate, unblinking. Beneath him, lashed to the belly of the craft, the torpedo waited like a sleeping verdict. Weeks before this night, in a cramped workshop far from applause, torpedo mechanic Hugo Bost had stood over these weapons, carving wood by lampshade, shaping crude fins to tame their first plunge. Engineers on paper said it couldn't be done. Physics on a chalkboard sneered at shallow runs. Toronto's harbor was too tight, too shoaled. Conventional torpedoes would strike bottom and detonate harmlessly in mud. British ingenuity answered with carpentry. Wood strapped to steel, simplicity defeating doctrine. Tonight would prove whether invention was miracle or suicide. Rook leaned close to his voice pipe. Approach corridor clean, depth assumption still in our favor. His tone carried no excitement, only calculation. Kest made a tiny aileron correction and felt the Swordfish trim out to an eerie stillness. A modern bomber might have needed speed to steady its nerves. A Swordfish steadied by surrender, by letting the air carry rather than cut.
Somber archival World War II realism. Calm, serious, and historically grounded. The harbor walls slipped behind them. Now came geometry. Angle, glide path, drop distance. Every fraction mattered. Too high, torpedo dives deep. Too slow, it fishtails uselessly. Too early, it becomes nothing but a gesture. Too late, Italian gunners find your flesh before your steel finds theirs. The weapon was not their ally. Not yet. It was a wager on precision. Kest's eyes locked onto the battleship's beam. He could trace its shape now. The armored shoulders, the stacked silhouette, the lifeboat davits jutting like ribs. Rook tapped twice, optimal bearing. The next signal would mean commit. Their training had stripped the moment of ceremony, but not of gravity. Every torpedo that entered the water carried 1,000,000 tons of strategic meaning strapped to its keel. Searchlights whipped back again, stabbing the sea. Now tracers began to feel for altitude, jagged firefly yellow in the dark. The gunners, at last, understood something was wrong. The enemy refused to rise where flak could claim them. Kest waited until the very edge of his fear thinned into pure control. Then, the final cue, Rook's gloved hand pressed once against his shoulder. Release window. Kest nosed fractionally lower. The Swordfish skimmed the surface like a creature returning to its element. He pulled the release. The aircraft lurched lighter. The torpedo dropped, kissed the water, dipped just enough to obey the old rules, then rose again to follow the new ones. It ran flat, impossibly flat, leaving behind a wake no Italian officer had ever been warned to imagine. For a surreal heartbeat, it was simply beautiful. A slender trail carving stillness into threat. Kest didn't allow himself to watch the run. He banked away, trusting physics now rewritten by wood and stubborn men. Rook craned over his shoulder, watching the wake lance toward history. This was not a strike yet. This was faith given shape, moving straight toward disbelief. The Italian fleet did not understand the threat until it was already inside their ribs. On the battleship Conte de Cavour, Captain Vittorio Salerno strode onto the open deck, expecting reconnaissance pests or high-altitude nuisance bombers. He did not expect torpedo craft, certainly not here, in water barely deep enough to drown a horse, let alone guide a weapon meant for armored giants. His first instinct was irritation. His second was disbelief. His third was fear. The alarm klaxon cut across the deck like a blade. Sailors spilled from hatches, boots hammering ladders slick with night mist. Floodlights ignited in hard, white bursts, casting the harbor into harsh, skeletal relief. For the first time, they saw the enemy, not sleek, modern monoplanes, but odd, lumbering silhouettes crawling just above the waterline like stubborn relics that had refused extinction. Someone shouted, "Biplanes, when, qui?" The word landed like an insult from another century.
Somber, archival World War II realism. Calm, serious, and historically grounded. Young engine room fireman Carlo Ardetti clutched a railing as a second shockwave, this one emotional, rolled through the crew. Torpedoes were in the water. That fact did not compute. The harbor was shallow. Every gunner on every shift had been told so. Training had sculpted certainty deep as bone. Impossible. But the wakes cutting across the moonlit slick were not rumors. They were geometry turned against them. Onshore batteries began to fire, but too high, too hurried, stitching fury into empty sky. Anti-aircraft crews dialed frantically for new elevation, but their calibration wheels lagged behind the truth. The enemy was practically skimming the skin of the sea. The harbor guns were built to swat birds. What came for them tonight flew like fish. On the bridge, Captain Salerno barked damage control orders before the blow had even landed, instinct shouting ahead of impact. Sealed bulkheads, engines on standby, clear forward compartments. But momentum is slower than torpedo wake, and steel takes time to obey. Doctrine takes even longer. Paolo, still gripping the railing, saw movement below, a rolling arc of white rushing straight toward the starboard flank. His mind reached for an explanation that matched training, but none existed. He whispered, barely audible, "È troppo basso." It's too shallow. The truth arrived before the explosion. The hit tore through the ship like a swallowed scream becoming thunder.
The hull buckled inward, steel twisting as compartments shock-flooded in an instant. Men stumbled, alarms howled, voices jammed together in a human chorus of disbelief. This was no probing raid. This was surgery aimed at the heart. Across the anchorage, more wakes streaked outward, each one a correction to naval arrogance. The once perfect rows of battleships now looked like cattle in a pen where the walls had turned invisible. Searchlights tried to stitch safety back into the night, but all they illuminated was proof. The British had found a way to cheat the seabed. From the cockpit of his turning Swordfish, Jonah Kest glimpsed the first plume of seawater and flame rising from Cavor's flank. Not a splash, but a wound. He didn't celebrate. There was no room. There were more targets behind that one, and more truths to break before the harbor fully woke. The Mediterranean didn't cheer either. It merely rocked the crippled hull gently, as if closing a hand around a victory the world had not yet learned to fear. Tonight, the illusion of invulnerability cracked, and through the crack, history began to pour.
Somber, archival World War II realism, calm, serious, and historically grounded. The first detonation was not just a wound, it was a verdict. Steel that once defined safety now rang like a struck bell, echoing across every hull in Taranto. The plume still hung in the air when the second Swordfish angled in, flown by Mira Lockett, her eyes narrowed not from fear, but from calibration. Reading wind, waterline, bearing, distance. She was not flying at a ship, she was flying at a fault in naval belief. The harbor had not yet accepted what was happening. She would make it understand. Lockett felt her torpedoes shudder beneath her like a tethered animal anxious to be freed. Her observer, Gareth Price, calm-handed, bone-steady, leaned forward just enough to give her the bearing tap, one knuckle to the cockpit brace. The ship ahead loomed larger with each breath. Littorio, one of Italy's pride hulls, moored wide to advertise strength. Tonight, its silhouette looked less like power and more like target geometry. Down on the decks below, sailors scrambled in wild diagonals, conflicting orders trampling each other across the shouting. Floodlights had found their discipline now, but their illumination served only the enemy. In revealing the harbor so brilliantly, they revealed perfect aim points. The gunners corrected downward arcs, but even now they were firing at speed profiles that still belonged to theory, not reality. The Swordfish were not escaping the doctrine, they were disproving it. The second wake began its run. Lockett held altitude so low the sea spray traced her landing gear. Littorio's massive hull filled her forward view until there was nothing else. Not sky, not harbor, not Italy. Just inevitability traveling in opposite directions. Price's voice, low and surgical through the intercom, drop. She released. The torpedo struck water cleanly, hardly splashing. For a blink, it looked like a toy sliding across glass. Then it steadied its nose and committed itself to the math the Italians had never believed to be solvable. Beneath them, the wake thickened, arrow becoming verdict. The Italian gun crews understood too late. One shouted, "A babordo, scendono bassi!" On the port side, they're too low. But theory was still collapsing in them, still rearranging itself into panic. The torpedo hit seconds later, a crushing forward shock that rippled through Littorio like a snapped bone, radiating pain into every bulkhead. The lights on her superstructure flickered. A sudden tilt bled through her posture. In Kest's peripheral sky, a third Swordfish rolled into its drop arc, the attack no longer probing, now harvesting. The harbor that had believed itself a citadel was becoming a bowl, collecting explosions instead of deflecting them. Down on the quay below, Italian signalmen waved semaphore with frantic precision, but confusion outran clarity. Tugboats started engines they had no orders for. Flooding teams waited for instructions that arrived garbled or late.
Officers grasped for doctrine that expired 10 seconds ago.
Somber archival World War II realism, calm, serious, and historically grounded. Up above, Lockett eased her stick, banking hard and climbing only enough to clear a mast. Her breathing stayed steady, not triumph, not shock, simply the mind of a craftsman whose work had landed true. Jonah Kest caught sight of Littorio's bloom of spray and flame from his own turning arc. One crippled ship could be misfortune. Two meant proof. History does not pivot from a single blow. It pivots when belief collapses twice. Searchlights finally caught his wingtips, drenching the Swordfish in violent white. The harbor had found him. The night had identified its enemy. But the biplanes were already inside the kill box. Too close for prediction, too low for safety systems, too slow for math meant for faster wars. Kest didn't panic. He simply pulled tighter into his run, because now the harbor wasn't just waking, it was bleeding. The harbor no longer looked like refuge. It looked like a furnace opening its eyes. The second blast had burned away doubt, and now Taranto answered with fury. Tracers tore upward in tight, clawing spirals, grasping for anything with wings. Kest felt the turbulence before he heard the gun lines. The air shuddered, as if wounded first. The Italians had finally recalibrated, and prediction now pointed dangerously lower. He pushed the Swordfish flattered to the deck, wheel almost trembling against the sea's breath. This was the paradox every British pilot knew too well. The slower you flew, the harder you were to hit, until the gunners learned humility and adjusted. That time had arrived. The harbor no longer overshot. Now it chewed. A bright line of tracer fire raked across the tailplane, and fabric ripped with an ugly snarl. Rook braced, instinctively ducking though there was nowhere to hide. "We're marked," he muttered, voice taut but intact. Not fear, calculation. The worst part wasn't being seen, it was being understood. The illusion phase was over. To port, another Swordfish took a glancing hit along its wing bracing. No flames yet, but the arc of the strike glittered, a metallic wink written in shrapnel. The formation was still alive, barely, but no longer untouchable. Hale signaled a lateral drift maneuver, not a full evasive break. That would ruin the torpedo run still inbound. But a weaving dance meant to buy seconds without losing bearing. Seconds were life. Below, Littorio's crew fought chaos with drilled instinct. Watertight doors slamming, pumps whining alive, counter-flooding equations being barked at terrified seamen who had never thought they'd live through a battleship tasting water like prey. But the battle above was stealing the harbor's attention faster than damage control could restore control. Shouting mixed with steel-on-steel clatter. The crisis was now layered.
Somber, archival, World War II realism, calm, serious, and historically grounded. Up above, Lockett eased her stick, banking hard and climbing only enough to clear a mast. Her breathing stayed steady, not triumph, not shock, simply the mind of a craftsman whose work had landed true. Jonah Kest caught sight of Littorio's bloom of spray and flame from his own turning arc. One crippled ship could be misfortune. Two meant proof. History does not pivot from a single blow. It pivots when belief collapses twice. Searchlights finally caught his wingtips, drenching the Swordfish in violent white. The harbor had found him. The night had identified its enemy. But the biplanes were already inside the kill box, too close for prediction, too low for safety systems, too slow for math meant for faster wars. Kest didn't panic. He simply pulled tighter into his run, because now the harbor wasn't just waking, it was bleeding. The harbor no longer looked like refuge. It looked like a furnace opening its eyes. The second blast had burned away doubt, and now Taranto answered with fury. Tracers tore upward in tight, clawing spirals, grasping for anything with wings. Kest felt the turbulence before he heard the gun lines. The air shuddered as if wounded first. The Italians had finally recalibrated, and prediction now pointed dangerously lower. He pushed the Swordfish flatter to the deck, wheel almost trembling against the sea's breath. This was the paradox every British pilot knew too well. The slower you flew, the harder you were to hit, until the gunners learned humility and adjusted. That time had arrived. The harbor no longer overshot. Now it chewed. A bright line of tracer fire raked across the tailplane, and fabric ripped with an ugly snarl. Rook braced, instinctively ducking, though there was nowhere to hide. He smuttered, his voice taut but intact. Not fear, calculation. The worst part wasn't being seen, it was being understood. The illusion phase was over. To port, another Swordfish took a glancing hit along its wing bracing. No flames yet, but the arc of the strike glittered, a metallic wink written in shrapnel. The formation was still alive, barely, but no longer untouchable. Hale signaled a lateral drift maneuver, not a full evasive break, that would ruin the torpedo run still inbound, but a weaving dance meant to buy seconds without losing bearing. Seconds were life. Below, Littorio's crew fought chaos with drilled instinct, watertight doors slamming, pumps whining alive, counter-flooding equations being barked at terrified seamen who had never thought they'd live through a battleship tasting water like prey. But the battle above was stealing the harbor's attention faster than damage control could restore control. Shouting mixed with steel-on-steel clatter, the crisis was now layered.
Somber, archival WW2 realism, calm, serious, and historically grounded. Captain Vittorio Salerno felt the shift before anyone reported it. Not a physical list, but a morale collapse so loud it could be heard through bulkheads. He shouted for counter-flooding sequences, shouted to keep discipline, shouted to restore psychological gravity. But voices echo differently in a ship that knows it has been outthought. Authority travels slower when prophecy has just been disproven. Above the harbor, the British formation re-angled for second-wave passes. They had come through the wall, not metaphorically, literally. The outer lattice of gun arcs had been cracked open by disbelief, and now the inner basin lay exposed. Anti-aircraft emplacements fired in widening improv, no longer supporting each other with coordinated patterns, but clawing wildly at any silhouette. The fortress had ceased to be a fortress. It had become a panic hive. Jonah Cast felt the shift too, the way gunfire lost rhythm, how the harbor's defense no longer resembled a net, but a swarm. When a defense loses pattern, it loses power. He didn't need a briefing to understand he was now flying through fear rather than system. Davy Rook leaned forward just enough for Kest to hear him over the wind. "They're unraveling," he said. Not triumphantly, but like a surgeon recognizing that the artery has already been cut. They're fighting the water now, not us. He was right. Down below, damage crews screamed through half-flooded passages. Fires bloomed where watertight doors jammed. Generator feeds flickered. Communications stuttered as hard lines drowned. You cannot coordinate a defense while drowning in the proof of your own miscalculation. Then came the moment every pilot waits for, not visually, but viscerally, a softening. The harbor's gun lines stopped feeling like walls and started feeling like scattered teeth. Their volume was still high, but their intelligence was gone. Hale's Swordfish to port rolled in for another strike path. Cast saw his silhouette cross a flare beam and marveled again at the absurd thing. A braced wood biplane moving like inevitability through a modern war harbor built to kill faster machines. A flare burst overhead, too close, turning the world white. For a second, everything froze in overexposed brilliance. Smoke plumes, leaning masts, wounded hulls, tracer arcs like broken constellations. And in that brutal flash, Taranto looked not like a naval base, but like a theater where the set had caught fire mid-performance. The fortress was not being outgunned. It was being redefined against its will. And every British plane still airborne now carried the burden of continuation, not survival. The breach was opened. The question remaining was how deep the knife would go. For a few terrible seconds after the third explosion, the harbor fell into a stunned silence. Not absence of noise, but the stunned pause that follows a wound too large for the mind to size. The guns still fired, the sirens still screamed, but psychology had gone suddenly weightless, like a building whose foundation has already cracked beneath the floorboards. Taranto was no longer defending, it was absorbing.
Somber archival World War II realism, calm, serious, and historically grounded. Jonah Cast felt the shift through instinct more than sight. Fires now burned in fat orange pillars across the anchorage, reflecting off the basin like molten scripture etched onto water. The smoke was rising slow, high, and straight, no wind to disperse it, which meant every new detonation wrote its own monument into the sky. A city of giants had become a gallery of injuries. Below, on the decks of the crippled battleships, sailors who had sprinted only minutes before now stared. Firemen who had been drilled to run hose lines now hesitated at railings, unable to reconcile the doctrine drilled into them with the reality unfolding in front of them. Torpedoes in shallow water, working. Ships armored for every kind of sea space but this one. Their faith in harbor walls evaporated. The fourth detonation came like punctuation, not surprise, a bass note rolling outward through the water with the heavy finality of a cathedral bell. Another hug gasped seawater through torn plating. Another anchor chain shuddered like a throat closing. Another mast listed, proud metal suddenly mortal. And then came the strangest sensation of the night. The gunners stopped roaring and started listening. Men don't consciously choose such a thing. It happens when certainty bleeds out of them. The searchlights that moments earlier lunged like hunting hounds now hesitated, beams twitching instead of sweeping. Every Italian eye in those emplacements was no longer searching for the enemy. They were searching for an explanation. Paolo Ardetti, still half-soaked from the damage control deck on Cavour, watched one of the strike waves bank overhead. He couldn't tear his gaze away. They looked unreal, not like attackers, but like consequences. He whispered, voice barely attached to breath, "Sono c'è dentro." They're already inside. Taranto had not been breached. Taranto had been entered before it understood. High above, Rook read the pattern change the way a cryptographer reads panic. "Whole harbor's gone passive-active," he murmured, meaning still firing, but the mind behind the guns was fractured. Anti-aircraft now served not to deny entry, but to beg for time. It is the difference between fighting a war and bracing for drowning. The Italian flag still hung from its staffs, the ships still floated, but the idea of their safety had already sunk. Kess looked toward the secondary basin, where more anchored hulls waited, still untouched, and felt the same thing every Swordfish pilot now did. This raid was no longer a question of daring. It was now a task of completion. The fortress was dead. The body simply had not finished collapsing.
Somber archival World War II realism, calm, serious, and historically grounded. Another flare burst overhead, slower this time, drifting on its tiny parachute like a lantern over a graveyard. Under its white bloom, the harbor showed its truth. Flame, steam, staggering silhouettes. A kingdom that had been struck not by strength, but by imagination carried on canvas wings. The silence under the gunfire was what ensured the outcome. Taranto was no longer defending a fleet. It was surviving a lesson. The last run didn't feel like an attack anymore. It felt like a signature. The harbor was no longer a battlefield. It was testimony. Jonah cast circled wide for his exit vector and saw the fire pillars leaning toward the sky like broken cathedral columns. Behind them, the anchored silhouettes of the surviving ships looked as if they were shrinking into themselves, as if shame had physical gravity. Somewhere over the waterline, Rowan Hale's Swordfish peeled off with a wounded wing but still flying, proof that ruggedness can masquerade as luck. Other crews were already climbing for rendezvous altitude. The strike had landed deeper than damage reports could tally. Its real crater lay in assumption, not steel. Cast held his heading long enough to confirm that no fresh guns were aligning on the outbound route. There weren't any. Taranto had stopped trying to contest the sky. It was fighting water, flame, and comprehension. The harbor that once projected power now hunched like a punched animal, still dangerous, but no longer certain of its teeth. Rook leaned forward and gave the simplest transmission of the night. Effect confirmed, multiple capital strikes, inner basin destabilized. No embellishment. Men who survive an ovation seldom need adjectives. On the Italian decks, Captain Vittorio Salerno watched from his bridge wing as counter-flooding pumps whined and his men slogged through chest-deep water they were never supposed to meet inside their own hull. He realized with surgical clarity that the British had not merely damaged the fleet, they had invalidated a doctrine. A navy could rebuild a ship faster than it could rebuild belief. Silence stretched across the anchorage, even as sirens wailed. Every officer there knew, if biplanes could do this, tomorrow's machines would erase the very idea of shelter. The age of anchored supremacy, the idea that a great fleet could sleep behind walls, had ended before sunrise.
Somber archival WW2 realism, calm, serious, and historically grounded. Kest banked north toward the open Black Sea, fire shrinking behind him until Taranto was no longer a harbor but a red bruise on the horizon. The Swordfish shuddered in a rising crosswind but still flew steady, stubborn relic steering the future. On the carrier, deck crews already waited with lantern shield lighting and silent urgency. These men knew before the rest of the world did. Tonight was not a raid, it was a demonstration, the kind history does not ask permission to keep. And somewhere, across another ocean not yet named by fate, officers in another navy would read the after-action report and whisper, "It can be done to Pearl Harbor as well." The British pilots did not celebrate upon landing. They did not shout or pound each other's backs. They dismounted their biplanes calmly, like craftsmen closing the lid on a tool chest. Victory does not feel like thunder to the men who make it. It feels like proof. Admiral Arden stood on the deck as the first crew walked in. He gave no speech. He didn't need to. He simply looked at Hale, at Kest, at the worn canvas wings still dripping saltwater mist, and nodded once. The gesture of a man acknowledging not merely success, but transformation. Taranto still burned behind the horizon, a lighthouse of consequence for navies that hadn't yet awakened to tomorrow. Before dawn fully broke, the world had already rotated into a new age. A war once ruled by battleships had just been claimed by airpower. The old world ended in a harbor that thought it was safe. The new one flew home on canvas wings.